It was the ultimate display of sheer audacity. Chloe Harrington stood in the sweeping foyer of a $4 million Buckhead mansion, Louis Vuitton luggage resting at her feet, sneering at the woman she assumed was just the pathetic, soon-to-be ex-wife. She confidently waved a set of brass keys, proudly announcing that Richard, her lover, was finally kicking his wife out and giving her everything: the house, the luxury cars, the lavish lifestyle. It was the perfect, triumphant mistress moment. There was just one catastrophic problem she didn't see coming. Richard didn't own the house. He didn't own the cars. In fact, Richard didn't own anything. And his wife, Naomi, was about to systematically destroy her entire world. Naomi Carmichael was a force of nature. A stunning, brilliantly sharp black woman in her late 30s. She was the crown jewel of Atlanta's fiercely competitive commercial real estate sector. She hadn't just broken glass ceilings. She had bought the buildings, demolished the ceilings, and remodeled the penthouses. As the sole heir and CEO of the Sterling Hayes Development Group, a company founded by her grandfather during the Civil Rights era and transformed into a billion-dollar empire under her tenure, Naomi possessed a quiet, unshakable power. She didn't need to flaunt her wealth. It was woven into the very fabric of her existence, from the custom tailoring of her Armani suits to the understated elegance of her sprawling, 6-bedroom estate tucked away on West Paces Ferry Road. Then there was Richard. Richard Carmichael was the kind of handsome, silver-tongued white man who seemed to glide through life on a combination of good genetics, a blindingly white smile, and unearned confidence. He hailed from a fiercely middle-class suburb in Ohio, but spent his entire adult life carefully curating the persona of a generational wealth aristocrat. When he met Naomi at a charity gala for the High Museum of Art 5 years ago, he was running a boutique, lifestyle consulting firm, a vague, pretentious title that essentially meant he introduced rich people to other rich people for a finder's fee. Naomi, despite her razor-sharp business acumen, had a soft spot. She was exhausted from dating men who were either intimidated by her monumental success or aggressively trying to compete with it. Richard was different. He was completely unfazed by her power. He was charming, attentive, and played the role of the supportive, adoring partner to absolute perfection. He loved being on her arm. He loved the galas, the private jets, the front-row seats at Fashion Week. When they married 3 years later, the society pages called it a perfect modern romance. What the society pages didn't know was that behind the closed oak doors of the Sterling Hayes corporate offices, Naomi's lead legal counsel, a ruthless attorney named Arthur Pendleton, had drafted a prenuptial agreement so airtight it could survive a nuclear blast. Everything Naomi owned, the houses, the cars, the investments, the art, was locked away in a complex web of irrevocable trusts and LLCs. Richard's name was on absolutely nothing of substance. He was given a generous monthly allowance and a vanity title as Director of Acquisitions at one of her smaller subsidiary companies, complete with a 6-figure salary to protect his fragile ego. Naomi loved him, and she was happy to let him play the wealthy patriarch. It was an illusion she willingly funded, so long as he remained loyal. But a man who builds his identity on unearned privilege rarely knows how to appreciate it. The cracks began to show in their 4th year of marriage. It started with subtle things. Richard became increasingly defensive about his phone. His business trips to Miami and Los Angeles grew more frequent, supposedly to scout new consulting clients, though his actual revenue remained a flat zero. Naomi, a woman who analyzed multi-million-dollar zoning proposals for breakfast, was not easily fooled. She noticed the unexplained charges on a secondary black card she had authorized for his use. charges at boutique hotels, high-end jewelers like Tiffany & Co., and absurdly expensive dinners at Le Bilboquet. She didn't confront him immediately. Confrontation without leverage was a rookie mistake. Instead, Naomi quietly picked up her phone and called Arthur Pendleton. "Arthur," she had said, her voice as cool as the ice clinking in her bourbon glass. "I need you to hire the best private investigator in the state. I want Richard's life turned inside out. Every text, every location, every purchase. Discretion is absolute." Within 3 weeks, a thick, 40-page dossier landed on Naomi's mahogany desk. Inside were photographs, bank records, and hotel security stills. The illusion of her happy marriage shattered in an instant, replaced by a cold, calculating rage. Richard wasn't just having a momentary lapse in judgment. He was living an entirely separate life, and he was funding it with her money. Worse than the betrayal was the narrative Richard had spun to his new paramour. Reading the transcripts of Richard's text messages, Naomi felt a bitter laugh escape her lips. Richard had completely rewritten reality. He had painted himself as the long-suffering, self-made multimillionaire, trapped in a loveless marriage with a financially dependent, emotionally unstable woman who was refusing to sign divorce papers because she wanted his money. Naomi closed the dossier, her dark eyes flashing with a dangerous, terrifying calm. She wasn't just going to divorce Richard. She was going to dismantle him. Chloe Harrington firmly believed she was the main character of a tragic, romantic movie. At 26, she was a Pilates instructor at an exclusive Buckhead studio, blessed with striking blonde hair, a perfectly sculpted figure, and an entitlement complex that bordered on delusional. She had moved to Atlanta from a small town in Florida, with big dreams of marrying into high society, and when Richard Carmichael walked into her studio for a private session one Tuesday afternoon, she thought she had finally struck gold. Richard was everything Chloe had ever wanted. He wore a Rolex Daytona, drove a pristine Mercedes-Benz G-Wagon, and spoke casually about his properties and investments. He showered her with attention, buying her designer handbags and taking her on weekend getaways to St. Bart's. To Chloe, Richard was a captive prince waiting to be rescued. During long, wine-soaked dinners at intimate Italian restaurants, Richard would sigh heavily, staring into Chloe's eyes as he spun his web of lies. "Naomi is impossible, baby," he would whisper, gently stroking Chloe's hand across the table. "She doesn't work. She just sits in my house, spending my money, refusing to let me go. My lawyers are trying to get her out of the West Paces Ferry estate, but she's threatening to ruin my reputation if I push too hard. I built everything I have, and she's just trying to bleed me dry." Chloe swallowed the lies whole, her heart swelling with righteous indignation. How dare this woman, this lazy, greedy gold digger, keep Richard from his true happiness? Chloe began to view Naomi not as a wife, but as a squatter in the life that was rightfully hers. As the months passed, Chloe's patience began to wear thin. The secret hotel hookups and hidden weekends were losing their romantic appeal. She wanted the public debut. She wanted the massive diamond ring. Most importantly, she wanted the $4 million mansion that Richard constantly complained about Naomi occupying. "When is she leaving, Richard?" Chloe demanded one evening in her high-rise apartment, which Richard was secretly paying for using Naomi's corporate funds. She crossed her arms, her manicured nails digging into her skin. "You promised me she'd be gone by summer. It's August. I'm tired of being a secret. I'm tired of her living in our house." Richard, ever the panicked smooth talker when cornered, made a fatal error. Desperate to pacify his young mistress and keep the fantasy alive, he lied. "She's leaving this weekend," he blurted out. She finally agreed to the settlement. She's packing up her things and moving out on Saturday. I have to fly to Chicago for a board meeting, but when I get back, the house will be empty. It's ours, Chloe. Finally. Chloe's eyes lit up with triumph. Really? She's actually leaving? Yes, Richard lied smoothly, kissing her forehead. By Sunday, the house is yours to redecorate. Richard did, in fact, fly to Chicago that Friday. He assumed Chloe would wait for him to return, giving him time to spin a new lie about Naomi delaying the move. But he severely underestimated Chloe's impatience and her desire to mark her territory. Saturday morning arrived, bright and humid. Chloe woke up, vibrating with excitement. She packed 3 of the large Louis Vuitton suitcases Richard had bought her, loaded them into her Range Rover, the lease for which was currently in Richard's name, drafted from a Sterling Hayes account, and put the West Paces Ferry address into her GPS. She wasn't going to wait for Richard to get back. She wanted to walk through those grand oak doors and claim her kingdom immediately. She wanted to see the look on the defeated wife's face as she dragged her cheap luggage out the door. Chloe even planned her outfit for the occasion: a sleek, white designer sundress, oversized Chanel sunglasses, and a perfectly blown-out hairstyle. She looked like money. She looked like the new lady of the house. As she pulled up to the imposing wrought-iron gates of the estate, her heart raced. The gates were open, likely for the moving trucks, she assumed. She drove up the long, sweeping driveway, admiring the meticulously manicured lawns and the stunning European-style architecture. Mine, she thought, a smug smile spreading across her lips. All of this is mine now. She parked right behind a sleek, black Porsche Panamera sitting in the driveway. Grabbing her favorite oversized tote, she marched up to the front porch, not bothering to knock. Finding the heavy wooden door unlocked, she pushed it open and stepped into the grand, 2-story foyer. The house was breathtaking. A massive crystal chandelier hung from the ceiling, casting a warm glow over the sweeping marble staircase. But there were no moving boxes. There was no chaos. The house was perfectly still, smelling faintly of expensive vanilla and cedarwood. "Hello," Chloe called out, her voice echoing in the vast space. "Is anyone here?" Footsteps clicked sharply against the hardwood floor from the adjacent hallway. A moment later, Naomi Carmichael stepped into the foyer. She was dressed immaculately in a tailored navy blue pantsuit, a tablet resting in the crook of her arm, looking every inch the billionaire CEO she was. She paused, her dark eyes scanning the young, blonde woman standing in her foyer. Naomi didn't look surprised, nor did she look angry. She looked mildly amused, like a predator studying a particularly confused mouse that had just wandered into a trap. Chloe puffed out her chest, dropping her designer bag onto the marble floor with a loud, authoritative thud. She pulled off her sunglasses, adopting a look of profound pity mixed with intense arrogance. "You must be Naomi," Chloe said, her voice dripping with condescension. "I'm Chloe. I know Richard said you'd be packing, but I wanted to get a head start on taking measurements for the renovations. I hope you're almost finished. I need the master suite cleared out by tonight." Naomi stood perfectly still. For 5 long seconds, the only sound in the foyer was the soft ticking of a grandfather clock in the study. Then, very slowly, a sharp, terrifyingly brilliant smile broke across Naomi's face. The trap had sprung, and the mouse had no idea the cage doors had just locked behind it. The silence in the grand foyer was absolute, save for the rhythmic, heavy ticking of the mahogany grandfather clock in the adjacent study. Chloe's haughty smirk faltered, just for a fraction of a second, as Naomi Carmichael didn't erupt into the hysterical, sobbing mess Chloe had envisioned. Instead, Naomi casually tapped the screen of her iPad, locked it, and tucked it neatly under her arm. She took a slow, deliberate step forward. The click of her Louboutin heels on the imported Italian marble sounded like a judge's gavel. "Measurements," Naomi repeated, her voice a rich, smooth alto that betrayed absolutely zero emotion. "For the master suite renovations. How incredibly industrious of you, Chloe." Chloe stiffened. "He told me you were leaving. He said the settlement was signed. I don't want to make this ugly, Naomi. But this is my house now. Richard wants you out." Naomi tilted her head, observing the younger woman as if she were a fascinating, slightly defective museum exhibit. Chloe Harrington, 26 years old, originally from Pensacola, Florida, currently employed at former Pilates in Buckhead, though your attendance has been rather spotty lately. You reside in a $3,000 a month apartment at the Sovereign, and you enjoy vanilla lattes with almond milk from the cafe across the street. Chloe took a physical step back, her manicured hands dropping from her hips. The color began to drain from her perfectly bronzed face. "Are you having me followed? Are you psycho?" "I don't follow people, Chloe. I have them audited," Naomi said pleasantly. She gestured gracefully toward the formal living room to her right. "Please come sit down. Since you're here to take measurements, we should ensure you have the correct dimensions of your new reality." Chloe wanted to run. Every primal instinct in her body was screaming that she had walked into a trap, but her stubborn pride and her desperate belief in Richard's lies glued her feet to the floor. She grabbed her designer tote and marched into the living room, sitting rigidly on the edge of a custom velvet sofa. Naomi didn't sit. She walked over to a polished side table and picked up a thick manila envelope. She unspooled the red string closure and pulled out a stack of heavily watermarked documents. "Let's begin with the real estate," Naomi said, dropping the first document onto the glass coffee table directly in front of Chloe. "This is the warranty deed for this estate, registered in Fulton County. Notice the name of the grantee." Chloe leaned forward, her eyes scanning the dense legal text. "Sterling Hayes Revocable Family Trust. Primary trustee, Naomi S. Carmichael." "I don't see Richard's name," Chloe whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "That is because Richard does not own this house. Richard has never owned this house," Naomi explained, her tone dripping with polite condescension. "In fact, Richard's total financial contribution to this property amounts to precisely $0. I bought this estate 4 years before I even met him." "But he said the consulting firm, his investments," Chloe stammered, pointing a shaking finger at the papers. "He makes millions. He showed me the bank statements." Naomi smiled, a cold, terrifying expression that didn't reach her eyes. She dropped another stack of papers onto the table. "Those bank statements were from a subsidiary corporate account belonging to my company. I allowed Richard to have signatory access so he could play the role of a successful businessman at the country club. His consulting firm hasn't generated a single dollar in revenue in 3 years. He is an employee of my company, Chloe. A highly overpaid employee with a vanity title, and as of 8 o'clock this morning, a terminated one." The room seemed to spin around Chloe. The sweeping ceilings, the crystal chandeliers, the promise of a life of unlimited luxury. It was all dissolving into thin air. "No," Chloe said, shaking her head violently, desperate to cling to the fantasy. "You're lying. You're just a bitter, jealous wife trying to scare me. Richard is in Chicago right now, closing a massive real estate deal. He's going to call me tonight, and when he finds out what you're doing—" "Richard is in Chicago," Naomi interrupted smoothly, glancing at the delicate Patek Philippe watch on her wrist. "But he is not closing a deal. He is currently walking into a conference room at the Palmer House Hilton. Shall I tell you exactly what is waiting for him there?" 800 miles away, the brisk wind sweeping off Lake Michigan did nothing to cool Richard Carmichael's soaring confidence. He strode through the gilded lobby of the Palmer House Hilton, adjusting the cuffs of his bespoke Tom Ford suit. He felt invincible. Sure, he had lied to Chloe about Naomi moving out, but he figured he could buy himself another week or two. He would tell Chloe that Naomi's lawyers had filed a last-minute injunction. Chloe was young, naive, and obsessed with the lifestyle he provided. She would complain, but she would wait. In the meantime, he would enjoy this weekend in Chicago on the company dime, maybe visit a high-end steakhouse, and figure out his next move. He took the elevator to the executive suites on the 12th floor, whistling a low tune. He pushed open the heavy oak doors of Conference Room B, expecting to see the usual array of mid-level executives ready to present their quarterly reports for his vague, meaningless approval. Instead, the room was empty, save for 3 people. Sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table was Arthur Pendleton, Naomi's lead legal counsel. Arthur was a 60-something man with cold, predatory eyes and the demeanor of an undertaker. Standing against the back wall were 2 large men in dark, unbranded suits, corporate security. Richard's confident smile froze on his face. His stomach dropped into his designer shoes. "Arthur," Richard said, his voice instantly losing its usual booming bravado. "What are you doing here? Where is the acquisitions team?" "Have a seat, Richard," Arthur said. He didn't gesture. He didn't offer a polite smile. "I prefer to stand," Richard countered, trying to project authority, though a cold sweat was beginning to prickle at the back of his neck. "What's going on?" Arthur sighed, opening a thick leather briefcase on the table. "As of 8 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, your employment with Apex Holdings and all subsidiaries of the Sterling Hayes Development Group has been terminated with cause. The cause being gross financial misconduct, embezzlement of corporate funds, and breach of fiduciary duty." "Embezzlement?" Richard choked out, his face turning an alarming shade of pale. "That's absurd. I'm the director of acquisitions. I have discretionary spending privileges." Arthur pulled out a neatly bound, 50-page forensic accounting report. "You used a corporate account to lease a 2024 Range Rover for a Miss Chloe Harrington. You used corporate funds to pay for a luxury apartment at the Sovereign. You billed $42,000 in jewelry and travel expenses under the guise of client entertainment. We have the receipts, Richard. We have the security footage. We have the text messages." Richard felt the air rush out of his lungs. He reached out to grip the back of a leather chair to keep his knees from buckling. Naomi knew. She knew everything. "Naomi is just... she's overreacting," Richard stammered, desperation bleeding into his voice. "Let me call her. I can explain this to her. It was a mistake, Arthur. Just a midlife crisis thing. I love my wife." Arthur ignored the plea entirely. He slid a second envelope across the polished wood of the table. "These are your divorce papers. You will note that under the terms of the prenuptial agreement you signed, specifically the morality and infidelity clause, you forfeit any claim to spousal support, property division, or severance pay. You leave this marriage with exactly what you brought into it, your clothes, and a profound lack of marketable skills." "She can't do this!" Richard yelled, slamming his hand on the table, a sudden surge of panicked rage taking over. "I've given her 5 years of my life. I built that subsidiary. I'm legally entitled to—" "You are entitled to absolutely nothing," Arthur cut in, his voice cracking like a whip, silencing Richard instantly. "Furthermore, Naomi has generously decided not to refer the embezzlement charges to the federal authorities for wire fraud, provided you sign the separation agreement immediately and vanish from her life. If you attempt to contact her, approach her properties, or contest this divorce in any way, The forensic audit goes to the FBI tomorrow morning. Arthur pulled a sleek black smartphone from his pocket. It was Richard's company-issued phone, or it was identical to it. Richard instinctively reached into his own pocket and found his phone missing. He had left it on the table during his flight. "Your corporate phone, email, and network access have been wiped," Arthur stated. "Your corporate credit cards, including the black card, were deactivated 2 hours ago. You have a one-way economy ticket back to Ohio, departing O'Hare in 4 hours. The security team will escort you to the airport." "My bags," Richard whispered, the reality of his total annihilation finally settling over him like a suffocating blanket. "They're at the hotel." "They will be shipped to your parents' address in Ohio," Arthur replied, closing his briefcase with a final, definitive snap. "Sign the papers, Richard. It's the only smart choice you'll make today." Back in the sun-drenched living room of the Buckhead estate, Naomi watched the defiance drain out of Chloe's eyes, replaced by the hollow, vacant stare of a woman realizing her entire world was a mirage. "He's broke," Chloe whispered, a tear finally spilling over her lashes, ruining her expensive mascara. "But the Range Rover, the apartment, he pays for all of it." "No, Chloe, I pay for all of it," Naomi corrected her gently. "Or rather, I did. I contacted the leasing office at the Sovereign this morning. Since the apartment was leased under a corporate entity, and that entity is no longer paying the rent, you have until Monday to vacate the premises. The Range Rover was a corporate lease. I've reported it as unauthorized use. If you drive it off this property, the police will flag it as stolen." Chloe gasped, her hands flying to her mouth. She looked around the magnificent room, the room she thought was hers just 20 minutes ago, and suddenly it felt like a prison. "You're a monster!" Chloe sobbed, her voice cracking. "You planned all of this just to ruin my life." "You ruined your own life, Chloe, the moment you decided to steal someone else's," Naomi said, standing up and smoothing an invisible wrinkle from her navy suit. "I simply corrected the paperwork." Chloe scrambled to her feet, grabbing her designer tote bag. "Fine. Keep your stupid house. Keep your broke husband. I'm leaving." She turned and marched toward the foyer, desperate to escape the suffocating presence of the woman who had just dismantled her reality. But as she reached for the handles of her 3 large Louis Vuitton suitcases sitting by the front door, Naomi's voice stopped her dead in her tracks. "Leave the bags, Chloe." Chloe spun around, her eyes wide with shock and fresh outrage. "Excuse me? These are mine. Richard bought them for me." Naomi walked slowly into the foyer, stopping just a few feet away from the trembling younger woman. "Richard purchased that luggage using a corporate credit card tied to Sterling Hayes Development. That makes them company property. You are welcome to take your personal belongings out of them, but the bags remain here. If you attempt to remove them from my house, I will have you arrested for possession of stolen property." Chloe stared at Naomi, realizing with horrifying clarity that the woman standing before her wasn't bluffing. She was a billionaire who had just legally and financially decapitated her husband in a single morning. She wouldn't hesitate to crush a Pilates instructor over a set of luggage. Humiliated, shaking uncontrollably, and sobbing openly, Chloe dropped to the marble floor. Under Naomi's cold, watchful gaze, she unzipped the luxurious cases and began violently pulling out her clothes, cheap fast-fashion dresses, makeup bags and shoes, shoving them into garbage bags that one of Naomi's house staff silently provided. 10 minutes later, Chloe Harrington walked out of the $4 million mansion she had planned to rule. She had no designer luggage, no luxury car, no apartment, and no millionaire boyfriend. She hauled her black garbage bags down the long, sweeping driveway on foot, calling an Uber on a phone bill she suddenly realized she couldn't afford to pay. Naomi Carmichael stood in the grand doorway, watching the younger woman retreat down the driveway. She closed the heavy oak door, the locking mechanism echoing with a satisfying metallic click. The house was quiet again. The illusion was dead. And Naomi had work to do. The flight from Chicago's O'Hare International Airport to Columbus, Ohio, was a masterclass in psychological torture for Richard Carmichael. Seated in a middle seat in row 32 of a discount commercial airline, his knees pressed painfully against the tray table, he stared blankly at the stained fabric of the seat in front of him. Just 12 hours ago, he had been sipping a macchiato in the first-class lounge, wearing a bespoke suit, and casually checking the balances of corporate accounts holding millions of dollars. Now, he was wearing a wrinkled linen shirt, holding a boarding pass with a Zone 4 printed on it, and nursing a lukewarm cup of tap water. When he landed, the reality of his new existence hit him like a physical blow. There was no black car waiting at the curb. There was no driver holding a discreet iPad with his name on it. Instead, he walked out into the chilly Ohio evening to find his 68-year-old father, a retired high school principal, waiting in a 12-year-old Honda CR-V. "Rough trip, Ricky?" his father asked, popping the trunk. Richard didn't answer. He couldn't. He tossed his single carry-on bag, a cheap canvas duffel Arthur Pendleton's security team had hastily purchased for him at the airport, into the back and climbed into the passenger seat. The smell of stale coffee and dog hair in the Honda made his stomach churn. Arriving at his childhood home in a quiet, aggressively middle-class suburb of Columbus was the final nail in the coffin of his ego. The house was exactly as he had left it 20 years ago. Beige siding, a slightly overgrown lawn, and a small, cramped driveway. His mother had made up his old bed, a twin-sized mattress pushed against a wall, decorated with faded posters of 1990s sports cars. Richard sat on the edge of the mattress, burying his face in his hands. He felt entirely, profoundly hollowed out. But Richard was a creature of delusion, and by Monday morning, that delusion had morphed into desperate, panicked action. He convinced himself that Naomi's wrath was temporary. She was angry, yes, but he was Richard. He had charmed his way into her life, and he could charm his way back, or at the very least, salvage his social standing. He borrowed his mother's outdated laptop and logged into his social media accounts, heart pounding, as he drafted a carefully worded, victim-playing message to his closest friends in Atlanta. He messaged Harrison Fordyce, a prominent investment banker he played golf with every Thursday at the Capital City Club. He messaged Gregory Vance, a real estate developer who had often praised Richard's business acumen at Naomi's dinner parties. "Hey guys," Richard typed, his fingers trembling over the keys. "Naomi and I are going through a rough patch. She's locked me out of the accounts and is making some wild accusations. Could really use a friend right now. Maybe a place to crash in the city while my lawyers sort this out." He hit send. And then he waited. Hours ticked by. He saw the read receipts populate. Harrison read the message at 10:14 a.m. Gregory read it at 11:05 a.m. Neither replied. By Tuesday afternoon, the brutal truth dawned on him. He hadn't just been cut off financially, he had been excommunicated. In the high society circles of Atlanta, Naomi Carmichael was the sun. She possessed the capital, the influence, and the power. Richard had only ever been a minor moon reflecting her light. The moment Naomi flipped the switch, his friends hadn't just abandoned him, they had actively erased him to avoid catching the collateral damage of her wrath. Nobody was going to risk a lucrative business deal or a coveted gala invitation from the Sterling Hayes Group to help a broke, exposed fraud. Desperate, Richard created a burner email address and tried to contact Chloe. He needed someone to validate him, someone to tell him He was still the successful, desirable man he pretended to be. "Chloe, it's Richard. Naomi ambushed me. I'm in Ohio figuring out a plan. We can still be together. I just need a little time to secure some capital." Her reply came back less than 5 minutes later. "You lied to me. You don't own anything. You're completely broke. I got kicked out of my apartment today, and my car was repossessed. Do not ever contact me again, you pathetic loser. If you do, I'm filing a restraining order." Richard stared at the glowing screen, his chest tight with panic. He was completely isolated. In a final act of sheer, unadulterated hubris, Richard drove his father's Honda to a strip mall law office off the interstate, armed with the divorce papers and the forensic audit Arthur Pendleton had forced upon him. He sat across from a rumpled, exhausted-looking family law attorney named Gary, aggressively demanding that the man help him break the prenup and claim his rightful half of the Sterling Hayes empire. Gary adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, silently reading through the first 10 pages of the pristine, devastatingly thorough legal documents Naomi's team had drafted. After 5 minutes, Gary closed the folder, slid it back across the desk, and sighed heavily. "Mr. Carmichael," Gary said, his voice flat, "this prenuptial agreement is practically bulletproof. But that's not even your main problem. Your main problem is this forensic audit. You embezzled over $300,000 from a corporate entity to fund an extramarital affair. They have bank records, video surveillance, and signed leases." "I was a director," Richard argued, his voice cracking. "It was discretionary spending." "It was felony wire fraud," Gary corrected him bluntly. "The only reason you aren't currently sitting in a federal holding cell awaiting indictment is because your wife offered you a grace period in exchange for your immediate signature on this uncontested divorce. My legal advice to you, sir, is to sign this paperwork immediately, get a job at a local hardware store, and pray to whatever God you believe in that Naomi Carmichael never thinks about you again." Defeated, humiliated, and utterly broken, Richard picked up a cheap plastic pen from Gary's desk. With a trembling hand, he signed his name on the dotted line, officially severing himself from the empire he had tried to steal, sealing his own exile. 6 months later, the crisp autumn air swept through the sprawling, brilliantly illuminated grounds of the Atlanta Botanical Garden. The annual Orchid Conservancy Gala was in full swing, and it was the undisputed crown jewel of the city's philanthropic season. Naomi Carmichael stood near a towering arrangement of rare white Phalaenopsis orchids, holding a flute of vintage Dom Perignon. She looked breathtaking in a custom-tailored emerald green silk gown that caught the ambient light like a polished gemstone. She was surrounded by a constellation of the city's most powerful figures, mayors, tech billionaires, and media moguls, all vying for a moment of her time. She was radiant. She was unbothered, and Richard's name hadn't been spoken in her presence for nearly half a year. As the jazz quartet transitioned into a smooth, upbeat tempo, the crowd parted slightly to allow Arthur Pendleton to approach. The ruthless attorney looked entirely out of place in a tuxedo, preferring the sharp edges of a courtroom, but he offered Naomi a rare, genuine smile. "A spectacular evening, Naomi," Arthur said, clinking his glass gently against hers. "The weather held up nicely," Naomi replied, her dark eyes scanning the glittering crowd. "How are the final filings looking?" "The ink is dry, and the judge signed the final decree this morning," Arthur confirmed, his voice dropping to a low, confidential murmur. "You are officially a single woman. Richard's legal ties to you, the estate, and the Sterling Hayes Group are completely dissolved. He is a ghost." Naomi took a slow sip of her champagne, her expression perfectly serene. "Excellent work, Arthur. as always. I must admit, Naomi, the execution was flawless, Arthur continued, a note of deep professional admiration in his tone. The way you timed the confrontation at the estate while I cornered him in Chicago, it was a brilliant tactical maneuver. You caught them completely off guard. I'm surprised you managed to put it all together in just the 3 weeks since you hired the investigator. Naomi paused. She lowered her glass, turning her gaze away from the crowd and focusing entirely on her attorney. A slow, chillingly brilliant smile spread across her flawless face. "Arthur," she said softly, her voice practically purring with quiet power. "You've been my chief counsel for a decade. Do you really believe I only found out about Chloe 3 weeks before I dropped the hammer?" Arthur's brow furrowed slightly. "The dossier. The private investigator's report. It was dated. I had the investigator backdate the executive summary for the sake of the legal filings," Naomi interrupted smoothly. "I didn't find out about Chloe Harrington in August. I found out about her in February." Arthur stared at her, genuinely stunned. "February? You knew for 6 months. Why on earth did you wait?" "Because in February I only had a cheating husband," Naomi explained, her tone as casual as if she were discussing the weather. "A cheating husband is a nuisance, but it's an emotionally messy divorce. If I had confronted him then, he would have groveled, he would have cried. He might have even tried to drag it out in court to embarrass me or extort a settlement just to make him go away. I didn't want to fight, Arthur. I wanted an annihilation." Naomi took a step closer, ensuring their conversation remained entirely private amid the chatter of the gala. "The moment I saw the first unauthorized charge at the St. Regis Hotel in February, I didn't get mad. I got strategic," she continued. "I let him keep using the card. I let him lease the Range Rover. I let him sign the lease for her apartment at the Sovereign under my subsidiary's name. I needed him to commit undeniably massive corporate fraud, papered over with his own signature, so that when I finally dropped the guillotine, he wouldn't have a single legal leg to stand on." Arthur let out a low whistle, thoroughly impressed. The embezzlement leverage. You built the trap and let him walk right into it. "Exactly," Naomi said. "But that wasn't the only reason I waited. Do you remember when Sterling Hayes acquired the Vanguard property management portfolio back in April?" "Yes, of course," Arthur nodded. "It was a minor residential acquisition, a block of high-rise units in Buckhead. I never quite understood why you wanted it. It didn't fit our usual commercial portfolio." Naomi's smile widened, her eyes gleaming with absolute, predatory triumph. "The Sovereign is one of the buildings managed by Vanguard. When Richard leased that apartment for Chloe, he thought he was hiding her in some anonymous luxury building. I bought the management company that owned her lease. I was Chloe's landlord for 4 months, and she had absolutely no idea. I literally owned the roof over her head." Arthur actually laughed out loud, a sharp, barking sound of disbelief. "My God, Naomi, you didn't just evict her. You bought the building just to ensure you had the absolute, unilateral power to throw her onto the street the exact second you desired." "I like to control the board before I make my first move," Naomi said, shrugging elegantly. "I approved Richard's trip to Chicago to get him out of the state so I could handle Chloe myself. I knew she was impatient. I knew she wouldn't wait for him to come back to claim the house. She walked right through my front door, exactly as I anticipated." Arthur shook his head in sheer awe. "Remind me to never, under any circumstances, cross you." "A wise policy, Arthur," Naomi murmured. Hundreds of miles away, the reality of Naomi's masterstroke was playing out in stark, depressing detail. In a dismal, brightly lit Enterprise rent-a-car office in suburban Columbus, Richard Carmichael, wearing an ill-fitting polo shirt with a name tag, was getting yelled at by a frustrated customer over a missing reservation for a mid-size sedan. He was 42 years old, living in his childhood bedroom, his credit score in ruins, and his future entirely devoid of the luxury he once believed was his birthright. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the marble floors of the Buckhead estate, a kingdom he had thrown away for an illusion. Down in Pensacola, Florida, Chloe Harrington was wiping down sweaty elliptical machines at a budget gym. She was living in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment with 3 other girls, driving a 10-year-old Toyota Corolla with a failing transmission. The designer bags, the luxury cars, the multi-million-dollar mansion, it all felt like a fevered dream. She had gambled her youth and dignity on a man who was nothing more than a parasite, and she had lost everything to the host. Back in Atlanta, the orchestra swelled, filling the botanical gardens with a triumphant symphony. Naomi Carmichael handed her empty champagne flute to a passing waiter. She didn't spare a single thought for Richard or Chloe. They were erased, dealt with, and discarded into the dustbin of her history. She turned back to the glittering crowd, a billionaire queen holding absolute court, the undisputed architect of her own magnificent destiny. 5 years later, the skyline of Atlanta had changed, permanently altered by the sheer will and boundless capital of the Sterling Hayes Development Group. A gleaming 80-story glass and steel behemoth now pierced the clouds above Midtown. It was named the Sterling Tower, the new corporate headquarters for Naomi Carmichael's empire. Miles away from that towering monument to success, the harsh reality of consequence had firmly settled over the lives of those who had tried to steal from the Queen. In a sweltering, fluorescent-lit grocery store in suburban Orlando, Chloe Harrington pushed a squeaky shopping cart down the cereal aisle. At 31, the glamorous, delusional Pilates instructor who thought she could evict a billionaire from her own home was completely unrecognizable. Her blonde hair, once perfectly blown out with expensive salon treatments, was pulled back into a messy, utilitarian ponytail. She wore faded athletic leggings and a promotional t-shirt from the mid-tier hotel where she now worked as a front desk manager. She paused to check the price tag on a box of generic brand oats, doing the mental math to ensure she wouldn't overdraw her checking account. As she reached for the box, her eyes drifted to the magazine rack at the end of the aisle. There, staring back at her from the glossy cover of Forbes magazine, was Naomi Carmichael. Naomi looked utterly magnificent. She was dressed in a sharp, ivory power suit, her dark, flawless skin glowing against the stark white fabric. The headline beneath her picture read, "The Architect of Atlanta. How Naomi Carmichael built a $10 billion real estate empire by cutting the dead weight." Chloe's breath hitched in her throat. Her hands trembled slightly as she gripped the handle of the plastic shopping cart. A wave of profound, suffocating shame washed over her. 5 years had passed, but the memory of standing in that grand Buckhead foyer, haughtily demanding the master suite, still kept her awake at night. She had been so blinded by greed, so thoroughly manipulated by a broke, lying man, that she had willingly cast herself as the villain in a story where she was completely outmatched. Chloe didn't buy the magazine. She couldn't afford the $7, and she certainly couldn't afford the psychological toll of reading about the life she had briefly, foolishly believed she was entitled to. She lowered her head, pushed her cart toward the checkout line, and silently prayed that nobody in her new life would ever find out about the colossal humiliation of her past. Meanwhile, 1,000 miles north, in a bleak, snowy suburb of Columbus, Ohio, Richard Carmichael was experiencing his own daily purgatory. He was sitting in the corner booth of a dingy, 24-hour diner, nursing a cup of burnt black coffee. At 47, Richard looked like a man who had aged 2 decades in half a decade. His once thick hair had drastically thinned. His bespoke suits had been replaced by cheap, ill-fitting khakis, and the blindingly white smile that had once charmed his way into high society was now permanently etched into a bitter scowl. He was currently employed as a regional sales manager for a mid-level office supply company, a job his father had practically begged an old friend to give him. He lived in a depressing, one-bedroom apartment overlooking a strip mall, his credit score still completely decimated by the sheer volume of legal and financial destruction Naomi had rained down upon him during his swift, merciless excommunication. Above the diner's grease-stained counter, a small, boxy television was tuned to a financial news network. Richard casually glanced up, and his heart immediately stopped dead in his chest. There, on the screen, was live coverage of the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the Sterling Tower. The camera panned across a massive crowd of politicians, celebrities, and industry titans, all gathered to witness Naomi Carmichael cut the ceremonial red ribbon. She was flanked by the mayor of Atlanta and the governor of Georgia. "Look at her," Richard muttered, his voice a raspy, pathetic whisper. He turned to the elderly waitress who was wiping down the adjacent table. "Hey, Brenda, look at the TV." The waitress barely glanced up. "What about it, Rick?" "That woman right there," Richard said, pointing a shaking finger at the screen, a desperate, hollow vanity still clinging to his soul. "The black woman in the white suit. The billionaire. I used to be married to her. That was my wife. We built that company together." Brenda snorted, tossing her dirty rag into a plastic bin. She looked at Richard's stained khakis, his worn-out shoes, and his half-empty cup of cheap coffee. "Sure you were, Rick. And I used to be married to George Clooney. Drink your coffee. Your shift at the paper company starts in an hour." She walked away, completely dismissing him. Richard stared at the television screen as Naomi took the podium, the crowd erupting into thunderous applause. A single pathetic tear rolled down his cheek. He wasn't just broke, he was entirely unbelievable. The life he had lived with Naomi was so grandiose, so spectacularly out of his league, that without her standing next to him, no one would even believe it had ever happened. He was a ghost, trapped in a mediocre life, forced to watch the woman he betrayed conquer the world without him. Back in Atlanta, the air was electric. Naomi Carmichael stood at the podium in front of her new skyscraper, looking out over the sea of flashing cameras and admiring faces. Arthur Pendleton stood a few feet away, nodding in quiet, respectful approval. Naomi gripped the edges of the podium. She didn't think about Richard. She didn't think about Chloe. Those names hadn't crossed her mind in years. They were less than dust beneath her designer heels. They were a momentary glitch in her otherwise flawless matrix, a glitch she had eradicated with absolute prejudice. When my grandfather started this company during the civil rights movement, he bought a single run-down storefront. Naomi projected into the microphone, her rich, commanding voice echoing off the glass facades of the surrounding buildings. He taught me that real estate isn't just about owning the ground you walk on. It's about ensuring your foundation is unbreakable. It's about knowing exactly who you let into your house and having the courage to tear it down to the studs and rebuild if the foundation begins to rot. The crowd cheered, mesmerized by her power. Naomi smiled, the crisp autumn wind catching the lapels of her suit. She was a black woman who had inherited an empire and turned it into a dynasty. She had loved deeply. She had been betrayed completely, and she had responded with a financial and psychological execution so flawless It belonged in textbooks. She had protected her peace, guarded her assets, and claimed her absolute, undeniable victory. The mistress had wanted the house. The husband had wanted the money. In the end, Naomi Carmichael kept it all. What an absolute masterclass in karma and consequence. Naomi didn't just teach Richard and Chloe a lesson. She gave them a PhD in the danger of crossing a brilliant, independent woman who protects her assets. It just goes to show that you can never truly steal what someone else has built from the ground up, and entitlement is a one-way ticket to rock bottom. The absolute audacity to walk into someone's multi-million-dollar mansion demanding the keys, only to walk away with your life in garbage bags, is a reality check we can all learn from. If you loved this story of billionaire revenge, unbreakable prenups, and absolute justice, you know what to do. Please like this video, share it with anyone who loves a dramatic twist of fate, and subscribe to the channel for more incredible, real-life drama stories. Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Tell us in the comments below, what would you have done if you were Naomi?